Hey everyone, thank you for making this ARC Salon number 3. ARC is the Arts-Disciplinary Research Center devoted to bringing various big picture thinkers and metatheorists together to find arches across various big picture frameworks, and also trying to bring these ideas to a wider audience. Today, for Salon number 3, we have ARC member Bobby Azarian here to talk about his work. Bobby's a neuroscientist, science journalist, metatheorist, author of the 2022 book, The Romance of Reality, How the Universe Organizes Itself to Create Life, Consciousness, and Cosmic Complexity, which is easily one of my top reads, not just of that year, but of many years.
Oh, wow.
He's also, as I said, an ARC member and the creator of the Substack Road to Omega, which I don't know, maybe will come up towards the end of the talk. But yeah, Bobby's going to share with us today his ideas, his framework, talk a bit about the romance of reality, I presume the unifying theory of reality, some ideas like poetic meta-naturalism, and maybe the integrated evolutionary synthesis, some core ideas in his book. But yeah, without any more ado, Bobby, take it away. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, and as I said before we started recording, feel free to jump in at any time if there's something that someone doesn't understand or doesn't agree with. But we'll try to keep those interjections like kind of short, but I think you should say them when you feel compelled to, so at the end we can come back to them. But I do want to get through the presentation, and the problem with something like this is that either I only cover a few of the topics in detail and then you don't get the full picture, or I try to cover everything and then it's just going through each thing really quickly, which I think is probably better today because there's a lot of stuff that I've said in interviews in the past that I think we've kind of covered in detail and have kind of left out a lot of the practical applications of the theory for people's like actual lives and for what's going on with, society right now. And that's really the important stuff because unlike a reductionist theory of everything, which is usually like a fundamental physics theory, this theory does not exclude emergent phenomena from that fundamental theory. So it doesn't leave out life or consciousness or civilization from that story. So I think, those theories of everything weren't true theories of everything, and that a non-reductionist theory of everything that includes emergent phenomena really is deserving of that title. And if we find that theory or what looks like that theory, and we have some sort of rough outline of it, even if we don't have it in perfect detail, it's a big advance because it means that what we do in our everyday lives is informed by that fundamental theory. So I'm going to try to argue that, this is an outline of that non-reductive theory of everything, and that its practical applications are kind of unlimited. When you start to see that story, then you can apply it to whatever kind of problem you're interested in, and you can see how it illuminates things that were previously obscure. So thank you from Brendan, and thanks for, putting the time in to, planning these interviews, and thanks for your work and your book Emergentism, because that's kind of where this is going. It's not something that I get into in this talk because there's too many specific ideas that I need to mention, but really it's kind of setting the ground for something like a cosmic religion, some sort of kind of instruction manual for how to optimize your own life and for how to optimize society, and something to answer our biggest existential questions. And that's normally the place of religion. And I'm not saying that science is here to replace religion. I'm saying what this theory does is start to blur the boundaries between science and religion or spirituality in a kind of strange way. And I'm not sure if that will be obvious by the end of the talk, but if not, hopefully we can discuss that. But basically, when you see this story, the new picture gives us something that seems religious, and people might object to it just on those grounds, but it naturally follows from the mechanistic story these bigger implications. So it's kind of weird in that some of the claims might be rejected just instantly by some people because they seem to violate like sacred truths of science. But when we really explore this story, we start to see that a lot of those truths were based on misassumptions because we didn't understand whatever laws we thought we understood as well as we thought. And also, there's just kind of this whole ideological aspect where some ideas became off grounds and then science claimed to have rejected them. But really, there was this war between science and religion, and anything that felt like it was supporting a religious narrative was kind of argued against and attacked. And we're still dealing with that today. And so that is kind of stopped a lot of it stopped science as a community from coming to what I think are the right answers because there's this ideological barrier where they're like, no, we're not supposed to talk about purpose, the universe having a purpose or life having some objective purpose in the universe. It's like that's violates all of these philosophical arguments and just, principles that we've decided were the way things should be done. So this kind of is going to challenge like some of the biggest things that we have considered to be like truth. And yeah, hopefully you find it convincing. So let's start with that. And I guess I have to share my screen. And then I have to start my slideshow. So the talk is on a unifying theory of reality. Since this is for ARC, and ARC basically wants to bring people together who have these meta theories and combine them into one overarching paradigm. And had I had more time, I would have loved to take the different meta theories from the different members in ARC and try to map them onto this picture. I should say this theory isn't my theory. It's a theory that is emerging that I saw all of these fields kind of gravitating towards this convergence, and tried to capture that from the perspective of a scientist and a journalist. And I'll talk about a little bit about my background in a second. But yeah, so as an advisor for ARC, like that's something, so I guess I'm addressing ARC too with this talk, is that I think there is this arch theory that would be a unification of unifying theories. So not only is a goal to map those theories onto this, so Greg Enriquez, Utah theory, and Daniel Gortz and others are working on political metamodernism, which this relates to in a way that we'll see. But also the other theories of everything that are out there. Stephen Wolfram has cellular automata and stuff. So if this does what it should do, it doesn't exclude many things. It's unifying. So it basically says all of these fields, like the higher level sciences, for example, like sociology, psychology, economics, they all have their place. And we won't be able to reduce those fields to physics, for example, or biology to chemistry, or psychology to brain chemistry, without losing something important in that explanation. So those won't be complete explanations if we go that route. So we don't want to exclude any sciences, but what the goal of this is to show that there are common principles that exist for all of these sciences where they are part of this coherent framework. And then we can start to get some clarity about, why those seem to be in conflict before. But basically, the idea is that complex adaptive systems exists at multiple levels in nature. So you can have a complex adaptive system that's an organism. That organism can be a single cell or a community of cells, so a multicellular organism. It can be a society, so like a human society or an ant colony that can operate as if it's an organism or an agent. And then you have human civilization as a whole would be an agent, or maybe you would say that the different nations are agents and it's not integrated enough to call the whole thing an agent yet. But I would argue that that's where it's headed. That evolution follows this trajectory, and basically, well, we'll get into that. So I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. So our goals are to understand the world around us. That's what science and philosophy strives to do. So this is going to kind of try to merge science and philosophy. We want to understand our relationship with nature. So this is going to suggest that life is not cosmically insignificant, that it's part of the cosmic evolution story. So it completely changes how we look at ourselves and our role in nature. And that's important because it basically says agency is real and that we need to exercise that agency to do what we need to do to continue the existence of intelligent life, conscious life in the universe. And part of exercising that agency, us doing that, us trying to save ourselves, is an intrinsic part of this cosmic evolutionary process. So we're also interested in how we can use that knowledge to improve our lives. So we'll talk about kind of some kind of self-help aspects, and how to improve society. So what can we do, like, for society as a whole? Does this have implications for what's maybe the best type of political system? What's the best sort of economic system? We want to answer our biggest existential questions. We don't get to all of them, but in the questions at the end, we'll try to address any that haven't been mentioned in the presentation. And this should be fun. Like, these are crazy, weird, psychedelic questions. Like these are topics, like reality is that weird where it pushes us to get into really strange topics, and we're forced there. And for a long time, people didn't want anything that sounded too wacky. And then we learned all of these new things about the universe that were mysteries. We learned in the late 90s about dark energy and dark matter. We know that consciousness is still somewhat of a mystery. And we don't fully understand the reason for the appearance of fine-tuned parameters that give our universe something like a design and something like this evolutionary trajectory towards higher complexity. So yeah, we're forced to go into weird territory because reality is weird. And these are questions that, like, stoners love talking about, watching Joe Rogan. Like, Joe Rogan has interviewed people like Sean Carroll and Roger Penrose about topics like this, and people love it, and they're not scientists. And there's this big hunger for this, and it would be great to, like, flip on like cable TV and see people talking about these kinds of issues, and these kind of deep philosophical theories. And there's some of that, but I think that, yeah, it can be, it's strange to me that this isn't a part of the cultural conversation, given, well, I think it's going to be, because everything that's going on with AI and questions about whether AI is conscious, and we can clearly see something like a singularity, some sort of future state that we're headed towards, that I think will basically create, like, more public interest in this. So, like, more people are going to be talking about this. And I think it's awesome that we're coming together and kind of getting an early start on these topics. Okay. And we also had set aside, like, we thought this would be like 45 minutes for the talk, and then time for questions afterwards. It might go like 10 minutes over that, but I'll try to keep it pretty short. So just know, yeah, there's a lot of big ideas here that won't be explained in enough detail to, like, address certain criticisms that people will make. Just know, if you're watching this, that this isn't the full story. There's lots that needs to be unpacked that we won't have time to do here. You can go to my Substack. The book has a lot of this as well. So here's a quick summary of the talk. So we won't So there's this unifying theory of reality we want to describe, and we're going to give a big picture overview of that theory in the first part of the talk. In the second part, we're going to talk about this sort of how it applies to, you know, your individual life and helping society. And so that's part 2, and it's called the teleological stance. So it's kind of like the self-help system that emerges from this theory. I'll quickly explain what I mean by these 4 things. So these are just different aspects of the theory, and there's a lot of overlap. Some of these terms are, you know, kind of the same thing. But there's a reason to have it broken up this way, because basically there's different aspects of the story that might be interesting to different people for different reasons. So a new cosmic narrative kind of refers to just a verbal description of what this theory is saying. It's saying that the universe is not this arbitrary system that's moving towards disorder. And that came from kind of this picture of this understanding of how organized systems, if they're just isolated from the environment, there's no energy coming in, and they're inanimate systems, how they behave, like a gas in a box. For example, if you put a gas in a box, or if you want to do this experiment at home, if you just squeeze some hand soap into your bathtub or your sink, and you'll see like a glob of soap organized, and then you'll see it disperse. And that's just because it's just exploring different regions of the state space. I don't want to get too technical, but basically if you have these particles that are not bound in any way and they're just moving around chaotically, you get this order to disorder transition if the system starts out in an order state. And when they understood this, you know, they wanted to apply, Boltzmann wanted to apply this idea to the whole universe. And he thought, okay, then this must be the trajectory of the universe. It must have started out in a highly organized state, and it's really ordered when we look around us because it was even more ordered before, and that order is breaking down. That's different than the original second law of thermodynamics. There's lots of confusion around entropy, what that means, because there are multiple definitions, and they've been conflated in the past where people are using it to mean disorder. Some people are using it to mean heat or dissipated energy. And there are similarities between these concepts, but what I'm saying is that this is not what the universe is doing. Even though entropy is going up, in a sense, it's not Boltzmann entropy. So the reason I'm bringing this slide up is because this conception of the universe led to all of these nihilistic assumptions. So if this is the particles in the universe and they're gradually falling apart, and it's just these particles, and assuming that they follow Newtonian laws, like the laws of classical physics, of not quantum physics, then this basically says that there's this mechanical trajectory, and that none of the agents have any sort of, none of the little particles have any sort of agency, because they're just following these mathematical trajectories blindly. And then the idea was that if we are just aggregates of particles, that we must not have agency, and that consciousness must not really be controlling our decisions and our thoughts. It must be just this chain of events that was kind of set in stone from the moment of creation. And actually, so quantum mechanics kind of threw a wrench in that idea. And there's a lot of controversy around what quantum mechanics means. Is it, you know, is nature probabilistic? Is there some randomness? And studies, experiments have kind of gotten out of, you know, tried to, you know, parse that question. And the new thinking is that, yes, there is a stochasticity or probabilistic or random nature to the dynamics of nature. And that is a big topic that we could spend an hour on, but I'm just going to say that quantum mechanics basically gets rid of this idea of hard determinism. So not determinism. There's other versions of determinism. Actually, this theory is kind of deterministic in ways, but we would have to talk about our definitions of determinism. But basically, this picture of a pool ball universe where there's just one trajectory and it's set in stone, That doesn't seem to be right. And we know even at the classical scale, there's chaotic systems which move in completely unpredictable ways. We could talk about whether that's deterministic truly or not. There's some controversy there, and we won't go into it. But the point is, this model made people think that the universe was becoming more disordered. That implied that life was transient. It implied that we have no agency or freedom in any choice. And that kind of led to this completely nihilistic view. And then with that scientific worldview, you had this sort of postmodernist era where people were understanding that, objective truth was pretty, there was doubt that there was objective truth because there's so much subjectivity to everyone's truth, that then there was another level of confusion and nihilism that it's like maybe there's no such thing as truth and everything's subjective and there is no sort of purpose to anything. Those are all just constructs. And what I'm saying is that's not true. That postmodernism pointed out some important problems with the old paradigms, that we do need to think about subjectivity, but that there is some objective universe that we can get closer to understanding. We can never understand it perfectly. Like Kant said, we can only understand the phenomena, not the noumena, not the things in themselves. So I'm saying that's true. But by modeling the world around us through learning, through science, and through adaptation, we actually get a more accurate causal map of reality. And we do start to understand its objective structure in some real way. So the new picture that this is putting out is saying that nature is intrinsically creative. So it's not just this random, like arbitrary system of particles following these simple classical trajectories, that actually nature generates these emergences where the fundamental particles come together in these, greater units that at the level of life basically start acquiring information about the world around it. And then the patterns encoded in those physical systems start to have causal power, and basically meaning and knowledge starts to have a causal effect on the world. And you see that in a very distinct change where a living system behaves in a way that's fundamentally different than an inanimate system. So an inanimate system falling down a hill can't stop. It just follows a trajectory. A person falling down a hill, let's say you're unconscious and you fall asleep on a hill because it's a beautiful day, and then this big gust of wind, this big, like tornado comes your way and pushes you down the hill, and there's a cliff. If you were a rock, you would inevitably fall off the cliff. But if you're human and you regain consciousness, you can push back on those forces pushing against you. And that's, your behavior is not predictable using Newtonian equations. So life is very different than in the inanimate world. And this led to vitalism, where biologists were like, well, physics doesn't explain life. There must be some special ingredient that we don't know about. What I'm and people say vitalism was disproved. What I'm arguing is that vitalism was actually kind of an élan vital or teleology. It was kind of a placeholder term for information, the causal power of information. And so there was a vital force in that. And now we know that that force is the causal power of information. So life is different than inanimate systems. It moves with a purpose or teleology, except it's not this mystical idea anymore. The purposeful movement can be understood as accumulation of adaptations through an evolutionary history that encodes information about the world in that system. And so it's knowledge. It's literally knowledge about the external world that's giving life this purposeful behavior, and that knowledge is not encoded in inanimate systems. So yep, the idea is that life has cosmic significance. It's part of this process of hierarchical emergence that occurs in these stages, which we're about to talk about. And that you could see this as life sort of fighting a battle against disorder. And there's this dialectical dynamic where like life is having to basically try to stay in existence against this entropic tide. or force. And in because it's forced to do that, it becomes more complex inevitably, because it keeps having to model the world in greater detail and accumulate more adaptations. And so evolution in this view will be a learning process. So you can look at it from, the perspective of life as sort of battling disorder. And what I'm saying, though, is you can also look at it from the perspective of the entire systems that is the universe. And in that case, we would not see life as sort of fighting against an inanimate universe. We would see the universe basically having this dialectical dynamic where there's this interplay and tension between order and disorder that leads to basically a synthesis of that, and that gives you this complexity or adaptive complexity. And that so life emerging, consciousness emerging in biological organisms would be the universe itself waking up through life, through adaptive complexity. So the universe is modeling itself through life. And it's just kind of a new way to look at it, as life being the mechanism for the universe becoming aware. And Carl Sagan had a beautiful quote that is on t-shirts and stuff that says, "We are a way for the cosmos to know itself." This is saying that's completely true. And then with this model of this hierarchical emergence, we get to understand what people mean by free will. And it's a really important concept, because we do have more freedom, thanks to what consciousness allows these, computational agents to achieve. We have something that I don't think any AI has at the moment. And that ability for consciousness to have causal power on the world means that we're actually agents in control of our destiny. So there's constraints to that. So it's not total freedom. But when people use the word free will, this argues that they're talking about something that's very scientific. We just didn't understand what it meant, and that denying free will is problematic for all kinds of reasons. Makes people depressed, first of all, makes them feel like they don't have any agency, and then they're less likely to act on that. So we're going to give a big picture view of this, but I do want to mention like a quote or two. So Christoph Koch, he's one of the leading neuroscientists in the world. He says the rise of sentient life within time's wide circuit was inevitable. Teilhard de Chardin is correct in his view that islands within the universe, if not the whole cosmos, are evolving toward ever greater complexity and self-knowledge. The laws of physics overwhelmingly favored the emergence of consciousness. The universe is a work in progress. Lots of people have had this idea in the past, in some way, some version of it. Hegel, Whitehead, Herbert Spencer, Teilhard de Chardin, Bergson, a bunch of highly respected physicists that were very influential in the 20th century, complexity scientists like Stuart Kauffman, and people like Ray Kurzweil, who says it's clear that the physical laws of our universe are precisely what they need to be to allow for the evolution of increasing levels of order and complexity. Ultimately, the entire universe will become saturated with intelligence. This is the destiny of the universe. So we shouldn't be scared of these words like destiny. It's these words actually map on to like a mechanistic reality. And here's kind of a picture of this trajectory. Well, we'll start with this one. So it may be kind of confusing because, I've said that there's some indeterminism in nature, but this sounds pretty deterministic, talking about a destiny. And what I'm saying is that there is a global determinism, basically that it's not totally random what happens, because of what are called attractors. So basically these attractors form, which kind of constrict the space of possibilities for how these systems evolve. And so nothing is perfectly determined, like all the details, like what an agent might do, what you might do, it's not determined. Like there's no way to predict it. And I'm arguing that it's literally like it's not set in stone to what you might do. But as a whole, as a collective society, we can see that there are emergent patterns of behavior and there are constraints that make the collective predictable in ways that creates these attractors, which are just these organized structures at all levels. So there's an attractor in a cell that keeps the cell in its stable state. There's an attractor, and this is in inanimate systems too, like a tornado or a whirlpool. You see these structures, these organized structures spontaneously form in nature. The idea is that life is something like that, but it's encoding information, it's learning. So it's like a tornado or one of these kind of cyclical, what are called dissipative structures, but one that's gained agency because now it can actually seek out energy intentionally and allow its continued existence, where a tornado is just kind of moving around purely chaotically and randomly. So yeah, there's some new jargon that we're going to have to accept. And those are attractors. So these stable states, these stable configurations that systems that are being pushed by a flow of energy move towards. So this gives you a sort of deterministic path. And these transitions where these little agents or particles or whatever you have, systems are interacting. They start interacting and they start becoming correlated and start finding synergy in these relationships, and this coherent whole emerges. That's called a phase transition. So similar to the phase transitions you learn about in chemistry in high school. So water freezing and becoming a solid, for example, but these are called non-equilibrium phase transitions. And we don't need to know what that means exactly, but basically they're phase transitions when a system is supplied with a flow of energy. So it has to be an open system. And if you drive that system away from this disordered state known as equilibrium, it self-organizes. And so you do get this deterministic trajectory at this global level, although that there's room for agents to kind of behave with some freedom. But we definitely our behavior is also a product of our knowledge and our beliefs. So there are constraints to that, but there is a certain degree of freedom in some people more than others, and we'll talk about what that freedom is. But so here's the big story: this recursive emergence through hierarchical self-organization. So you see it going from the inanimate world to the world of life and civilization. And what I'm saying is that this is the story of cosmic evolution. It's things coming together to make larger things, kind of like Voltron assembling or something, where you have these different agents that combine and make a larger agent. And so the biosphere in this picture is one integrated agent, essentially, that there's one organism that's developing, and humans are forming something like a global brain, like a nervous system for that organism. And the organism itself, the body, would be what has been called Gaia, but it's basically just the network of ecosystems that are all interconnected, and they seem to be self-regulating. So it's a cybernetic system. It basically has a certain element of control, and it can biosphere maintains a temperature and gas composition in the atmosphere that's friendly for life. And it's not hard to do that. It's literally like your body keeping homeostasis is what the biosphere is doing at this global level. And the idea is that when life spreads to another planet, because it has to, because our energy supply will be gone at some point, we have to spread out and find new sources of energy. That's this island of knowledge spreading. And it's the biosphere, in a sense, self-replicating. And the idea is that life, the way it's covered the planet Earth, and it started with a single cell, but now it just completely covers the Earth, and changed its dynamics to this non-equilibrium state. We call it this organized state that it self-maintains. That the entire universe, that the where this trajectory is headed is that the universe becomes a computational system, a fully integrated computational system. And I just had an article come out at the website Big Think today, arguing that the universe is a neural network at the fundamental level, which is speculative. You can check that out and you can read the source papers. But this story of hierarchical emergence, where you have life learning and then you have like cultures like learning, that would be part of that neural network theory. Actually, the neural network theory isn't like just this low level theory. It actually recognizes real emergence, and the learning that we do is part of this neural network story. But so here's a picture of the brain. There's this project called the Global Brain Project that has been trying to put this idea in the mainstream's consciousness for a couple decades now. Francis Heiligen, Ben Goertzel, big AI guy, are part of this. And really, you know, people push back against this idea, against Gaia, because it has the word God, and people, you know, went crazy and started praying to Gaia or whatever. I don't know, but that has caused people to reject ideas that are perfectly good scientific ideas. So Massimo Pigliucci is a philosopher that was saying Gaia was pseudoscience, absolutely nuts. Lynn Margulis supported this, Carl Sagan's first wife, and she was super respected biologist that allowed us to understand how eukaryotic cells came about through this like symbiosis. So her, E.O. Wilson, John Maynard Smith, all of these people understood that there's multi-level selection, and that at this higher level of the collective, there's similar dynamics to an organism. So they're all sort of self-maintaining. There's a word, autopoietic systems. And that's basically a characteristic of life, that it's self-regulating and self-maintaining and self-copying. So yeah, I've already mentioned a lot of this. This is from Ray Kurzweil's book, but the idea is that there are these emergences. So you have physics and chemistry, then the emergence of biology, then brains and technology, and then there's going to be an inevitable merger of biological intelligence and technology. And the final state, well, not the final, because this could just be one stage in who knows, an unending chain of emergences. But yeah, the idea is that patterns of matter and energy in the universe become saturated with intelligent processes and knowledge, and you get this state where the universe basically becomes something like an integrated mind. And that has all kinds of crazy implications. And, you know, people didn't even want to consider this because it was this teleological model, but you see that there's nothing unscientific about this model. It just gives you some implications that most people don't want to think about. Like, it looks like there's a design, but we can't be scared of that anymore. And there's explanations for that design that don't involve a creator. So leaving basically, so that's an ideological thing too. If we trace the history of this, you could see why teleology became like a dirty word, and no one wanted to accept that model. And it's interesting that, you know, Kurzweil and people like that put that out there, but he doesn't use the word teleology, so no one complains about it. But the people who know a bit of philosophy are probably like annoyed, like saying, why is Kurzweil, you know, saying this, something as crazy as this kind of teleological cosmos? But now with these papers coming out, Universe is a Learning Machine by Lee Smolin and Jaron Lanier, and Sabine Holstenfelder put out an article about the universe having a structure like a brain. I think there's a lot of support for this teleological narrative from all these different fields, like evolutionary biology seeing this progressive evolution, and then physicists seeing this in this more fundamental way. So, and then technologists and people also seeing this, you know, trajectory towards a singularity. So here's just a picture of, on the left, you have single-celled organisms, agents coming together to form a new collective unit, like a multicellular organism. So paramecium come together and form slime molds. Humans, we don't often think this way, but we are communities of agents. We are communities of cells. And if you keep zooming in, you just see cells. There's no longer a human. So we are an example of collective intelligence as well. And then so you have collective intelligence when those agents come together and they make societies or something. So you see that this is a hierarchical process, and it occurs for thermodynamic reasons we won't really go into, but basically we all have to extract energy from the world constantly. We do that with eating, and we also are getting energy like fossil fuels, like all, you know, solar, all of that is also to maintain the organized state of human civilization. So we have to get energy. And the reason that these evolutionary transitions happen is because there's an effective synergy such that when we work together, it makes our task easier than if we tried to do it alone. So there's a thermodynamic benefit to cooperating. And what this story tells you is that there's competitive and cooperative evolution, and we try to ignore cooperative evolution. People like Richard Dawkins try to explain all of cooperation and empathy in terms of this selfish framework, and that's wrong. To try to do that, and you can kind of find ways to try to explain that all from selfishness, but we actually see that cooperation is the essence of evolutionary transitions, which Richard Dawkins knows is completely important. So, I mean, I think if you even, there's a lot of things that Dawkins and Dan Dennett have said that completely support this kind of framework. And there's other things they've said that seem to contradict that, but I think the contradiction is with them, that there's this coherent framework. They don't totally want to go there because there's some implications that they might not be comfortable with as, famous atheists, but actually they have made lots of arguments that support this idea. For example, Dawkins, that intelligence is inevitable, and if we find alien intelligences, they're most likely are alien biospheres. There could be a trajectory towards human-like intelligence. And when I was talking to Michael Shermer about this, he said that Dawkins convinced him that he thought that they wouldn't be human-like because it just seems too random. The idea was that everything is this contingent process in evolution where there's no direction or sort of tendency towards higher intelligence. And Dawkins argued, and a lot of people have argued this based on this idea of convergent evolution, this work by Simon Conway Morse, that because of convergent evolution and because of these attractors that emerge, you might actually find a distribution of species on other planets very similar to Earth, and there might be some sort of tendency to produce bipedal creatures. How similar, we don't know, but the whole point is that there is this trajectory towards higher complexity, and that equates to progress for human society, that Stephen Jay Gould really tried to kill for ideological reasons. He didn't like the teleology. He didn't like this hierarchy. But just people should know that there are a lot of evolutionary theorists that actually have said that evolution is progressive and leading to higher and higher complexity. It's not a statistical illusion. So phase transitions occur at this edge of chaos. So right before each transition, the system needs chaos to basically, if the system's too rigid, it can't transition to a higher state. So what I'm saying is that understanding this paradigm gives us a model for things that are going on with society that we thought science had nothing to say about. So right now, there's an age of chaos we're experiencing. What I'm saying is that that's indicative of a phase transition at the social level, and that if you are going to have this shift to a new worldview, that doesn't happen without a period of chaos. There's a chaos injection. So this happens with inanimate, non-equilibrium, dissipative structures. So systems that are kind of like we mentioned, whirlpools and tornadoes. So there's other like chemical clocks and stuff, and they go through a similar evolutionary trajectory. And that chaotic period is when annealing occurs. And annealing, like people know that word mostly from like creating swords. That's this process of annealing. What that sword, making the most strong sword, what they were doing was they kept heating up the sword and hammering it at the same time, and doing that over and over, like in like a iterative process. And what that was doing is it was basically when you make the sword the first time, all of its atoms aren't in the most robust and consolidated configuration, and heating it up introduces some motion, it introduces some chaos, and then you reshape it. And each time there's that shaking up, you get the system settles into a more organized, stronger, more resilient state. So I'm saying that this goes on at the social level, and basically all the chaos is kind of the injection of motion that the system needs to transition. And what is happening, or what can happen if you take advantage of this opportunity, the system could collapse, it could transition into a collapse state, is that we can actually have some control over this process and bring about a phase transition in the right direction if we do what we need to do to create that global coherence. And what I'm arguing is that that requires a unifying worldview, and that this could provide something like a foundation for that worldview. But if that's true, then we know why there's chaos right now. It's not a big mystery, and it is an opportunity if you see this. And Peter Turchin is a scientist who actually predicted the age of chaos in 2020 back in 2010 in a paper that was published, I think, in like Nature or a highly respected journal. And then when all this chaos started breaking out, the pandemic, what was going on in politics, the culture wars, Atlantic and some other websites that really respected covered this story and was like, wow, Peter Turchin seemed to get it right. And he predicts that it's going to get worse. But basically, he has this field he developed called cryodynamics, which basically says we can analyze historical patterns, see these trends, and make predictions about the future of society. And that's really exciting because we didn't think we could do that. Basically, that's kind of Isaac Asimov's idea of social statistical mechanics. And we'll talk about that and how we can use that later. I should mention that Turchin's dad was Valentin Turchin. And he was kind of the first person that laid out this metasystem transition theory is his theory. So there's a book called The Phenomenon of Science, which is kind of a play on Teilhard de Chardin's Phenomenon of Man. Barely anyone knows about this book because he was this big guy in Russia, and then he had to flee here because Russia didn't like the philosophy in that book. It was this philosophy. It was the cybernetic worldview. You can see that at the Principia Cybernetica project. If you Google that, it's very similar to this in the Road to Omega project. So what does this mean? It means that, it means the future is semi-predictable. So people predicted that the internet was going to come and go. Nobel Prize winning economists made that statement that the internet would be as influential as the fax machine. Internet may be just a passing fad as millions give it up. You see this other clip. What this says is that if we understood this teleological narrative of continual complexification like Teilhard de Chardin did, we would be able to predict when we saw the internet, we would know that that was here to stay because it's this new means for interconnection. So it's part of the biosphere self-organization. Same thing with blockchain technology. A lot of those companies may just completely fail, but overall, when you see a technology that's like this, it's basically kind of favored by nature. So it gives us a whole new level of predictive power. It tells us things, and we should talk about this. For example, how to optimize our society. So this shows you so complexity, for example, is a combination of variety and integration. So a system's more complex. It has more parts that are diverse and more connections between those parts. So there's strength in diversity. We want to become more connected because that's opening up channels for information exchange. So we exchange information and ideas and become more knowledgeable and make our world model more accurate over the long run if we're exchanging information. But we don't want it to become a hive mind. And when people hear this, they think it's saying, that's what's going to happen, or maybe that's good. And this is saying that it's not a hive mind because it's not homogenous. We want variety among the parts because that allows for a division of labor. So we want to figure out how to preserve diversity and variety while promoting interconnection. And there's also this hierarchical story. And there's a lot of problems of hierarchy that postmodernism has identified, but hierarchy is actually good for tons of reasons, for resilience, for more computational power. But what you want is, you want to have fluid movement, like up and down the hierarchy. You don't want certain people being at the top for, any reasons other than, like merit. So it seems that we don't want just one global government to replace like individual governments and nations and towns and communities. We want to have all of those things existing at those levels, but we want to have global coordination as well. So isolationism would be not good in the long term. There's reasons that it could work in the short term and potentially be better. But in the long term, everything's connected. And we saw that with the pandemic and the financial collapse of 2008. And so for that reason, we have to come together. And what I'm saying is that we have to create a phase transition. We have to actively try to bring about the next phase transition that leads to basically a globally coordinated state, because we won't be able to solve our existential challenges that we face without that coordination. We can't solve like climate change, the AI problem potentially, World War II, seeming like it's basically imminent. We're going to have to come together, and a unifying worldview would do that. I didn't really get to talk about why this is unifying. So there's, let's spend, Brendan, do we have 10 minutes to talk about part 2, like the self-help stuff? Or do you think we should go to questions?
Yeah, we're about 55 minutes in. So maybe if you think you can do part 2 on the quicker end, and then
all right,
and then we could open things up. Maybe, I don't know, 10 more minutes or so.
Yeah, and I'll do it. Yeah, great. I'll do it quickly. But this is the part that I really want to talk about, so I don't want to leave it out.
Okay, well then, yeah. I mean, also, I think people are here and willing to hang out for a bit too, I would assume. So if you want to, if this is the, something you especially wanted to focus on, then by all means, I don't know, let's say 15 minutes.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So I was going to say, since it's what I want to focus on, the discussion could be kind of focused on that. We can talk about whatever, but I'll try to go through it quickly, hopefully in 10 minutes, and just know that this is a very short version, because I hope we can talk about these things, because it's better to explain it anyway. And the slides are kind of a mess, so this works out perfectly. So basically what I'm saying is that you can take this picture and you can construct a sort of personal narrative and a personal game. And what that allows you to do is basically gives you an instruction manual for self-optimization. So there are a lot of ways that we're behaving on a moment-to-moment basis that aren't optimal for our long-term goals, and for our decision-making is not optimized. So this tries to kind of give you a story that makes a lot of this stuff that was just explained, something that's present in your conscious mind on a moment-to-moment basis. And I think there could be power in that. So the story is basically, there's this tendency towards decay in the inanimate world. Things fall apart. So that's associated with the second law of thermodynamics. And life can be understood as an infinite game against this tendency toward decay. So things fall apart. To stay organized, to continue existing, life has to extract energy. If it has to extract energy from the environment, it has to model the world. And so that gives us a challenge. We have to acquire knowledge about the world to continue existing. So there's a game where we're looking for basically bits of knowledge, and we acquire this through adapting and learning. And I'm going to argue that learning and adapting are the same process, the same mechanism or algorithm, and that we can understand this kind of vague thing about looking for solutions in a more like detailed kind of formal way. So, and we'll explain that. So basically, this is kind of an appeal to the importance of systems thinking. So we need to think about ourselves as systems, but also that we're systems inside larger systems of other agents, and the whole connected. So what I do, maybe I want to litter. Maybe I'm like, every time I'm in the car, I'm like, yeah, I'm doing what's good for me. I'm being selfish, and I don't feel like stopping and taking my time to throw this in the trash. I'm going to just throw it out the window. And that may be good. You may get a payoff for that in the short term. There may not be, that may seem like the best thing to do, but you learn that if everybody does that, it comes back to bite us all in the ass, and we can't operate in those terms, because anything like negative effects of our behavior will come back to us in a integrated. So that's really what this tries to make you do. And I'm calling that meta awareness, to make a distinction between self-awareness. Is that, okay, you have basic awareness, where you just have an experience of the world. Then you have a self-awareness that emerges with humans, maybe before, but you're aware that you're this agent and you have this model and you can kind of tweak it. You can adjust your behavior when it's not optimal, let's say, assuming you have good executive control and cognitive control. And so basically, meta awareness would be one level above self-awareness, where you're not just, you don't realize you're this conscious agent and that your effects have a, influence on the world, but you realize that you're part of a larger meta system, and that you're part of an interconnected system of agents. And in some way that makes your neighbor part of you. Like it's just one unified computational network, the network of life. And that's why, whether it's the environment, whether it's other people, we should care about their well-being, because it's going to affect us as well. So for selfish reasons, you can care about it, but really, yeah. So what this does is, when you realize you're part of this larger system, then cooperation becomes a no-brainer, because then you're like, oh, I'm just increasing my computational power by working with you. I'm forming a collective mind. Like I'm extending my mind the way my phone is an extension of my mind that increases my computational power. When I work together with you, we're creating this synergetic, symbiotic organism, and we can solve problems more easily. So coming together to solve our problems, for example, using this variation and selection mechanism that I haven't talked about, or won't have much time to talk about. Maybe we can talk about that. The evolutionary algorithm is like, basically what this shows is that evolution works through variation and selection, and that when we learn in the real world, we learn through trial and error learning, and that those are the same thing. It's basically you're experimenting with trials, behaviors, theories. This is how science works. This is how, when we experiment with political ideologies, we're constantly experimenting, we're testing those. And then there's a natural selection process where some don't work as well. They're not as fit. And then the less fit ones get filtered out. And so basically you see that evolution is a learning process, the way we learn with reinforcement learning, that it's the same evolutionary learning algorithm that we're using for science, for learning, for evolution. And it's a Bayesian process. And we'll quickly talk about that. And you can kind of frame this with a new narrative. Like if one can speak of a cosmic war, it's a war between monotony and novelty, between stasis and creativity. And in this war, our side is not destined to lose. If we choose to apply our unique capacity to create explanatory knowledge, we could win. So that's David Deutsch with a talk called After Billions of Years of Monotony, the Universe is Waking Up. So we can see this as a story of order versus disorder, life versus entropy, or knowledge versus ignorance. But I'm arguing that those two things aren't just opposites, they're complementary, and they work together to create this self-organization. And there's a Eastern term from Buddhist philosophy called interdependent co-arising, which I think captures this story, this co-evolution through this dialectical dynamic that Hegel and Marx and Errol Harris and other people in philosophy have recognized as important. So there's this problems create progress principle. Basically, that's another part of this dialectical dynamic. We have this problem where we need to survive. We need to stay out of thermodynamic equilibrium, a state of maximum disorder. And that forces us to basically play this game where we have to find energy and avoid threats. So we have to model the world. And we can see that as a game where life has to search the configuration space for solutions to the problem of survival through trial and error. Via Darwinian evolution. Before things have brains, it's Darwinian evolution. Like a whole population is learning. Organisms can't learn. So learning is really things die out, and the things that have better genetic templates that are more predictive of the environment stick around and make copies of themselves, the variation. So there's learning at the level of the whole population before brains, but with the emergence of brains, things don't need to die for learning to take place. And then you can start learning in real time, and that's neural memory on top of genetic memory. And then with the emergence of culture, you have cultural memory, and then you spread ideas from brain to brain through memes. So this story applies at all levels, and we see this mechanism repeated at those different levels, and we're almost done. So Dan Dennett had this concept of life exploring the design space, So basically, there's a problem. It's staying far from equilibrium, and you got to find the solution for that. So this diagram really has it all. It looks kind of complicated, but it's pretty simple. So let's break it down. You have an organism. In this model, an organism is an embodied theory about how to survive. So it's kind of like a little scientific theory about how to survive. And every organism that the biosphere produces um, is a little test about how to stay in existence. And so when that organism, let's say this is the first single-celled organism, it's not, it's actually like a eukaryotic organism, but let's say this makes copies of itself, because that's what happens with reproduction. So as soon as you get life, you get all these, you get this first generation of copies. And so you have a design that works, and then you get all these variations on the design, and they'll compete, or maybe they won't. Maybe they'll just, duke it out against nature. So some will stay in existence, and some won't be good at surviving or extracting energy, even if there's no competition. And so some die out while there's a winning design. That design is the best predictor. It's the best at predicting its environment with the knowledge that it's acquired. And it's just randomly finding these new bits of knowledge. But the helpful ones basically get like cemented into the gene pool, because those are the only copies that survive. So it's like the updating of a genetic template over every generation. And what you see is that this is actually the same process as science. So science has these different competing theories. And Karl Popper was the one to show this equivalence, and it led to evolutionary epistemology. So science has these different competing models. These models are tested and subjected to criticism. Some die out. The ones that are predictive stick around, and then people tweak the model, and they have their own version of the models to explain things that the model didn't explain, because the model will always be inaccurate or incomplete. And then there will be just generations of that testing process with theories. And so whether it's evolution or whether it's learning, this could be, for example, these different behaviors that you have in mind. Like, what am I going to do in the next moment? Someone's coming at me. I could do this or this or this. You got to try one out. Maybe it works well. Maybe it doesn't. If it doesn't work well, you don't repeat that behavior. If it does work well, you keep it. And the next time something happens, you do that again. Maybe you tweak it because maybe it didn't work perfectly and you want to try a little variation. But no matter whether it's learning or science or biological evolution, there's this process of knowledge creation through this iterative testing process. And this produces knowledge, and it makes life better at predicting the world around it. Now, some niches are going to be very complicated and some are going to be simple. So this optimizes the organism, but only for that niche. So if the niche is simple, the organism doesn't need to be complicated. But this evolutionary process, basically, organisms will keep discovering, they will keep having mutations that allow them to, for example, extract a new type of energy, like basically food, heterotrophy. The early organisms like fed off chemical food, and then other organisms later, they had a mutation that discovered that they could eat another organism. And so that was a new energy source that was unlocked by this variation and selection process. And so overall, over time, you get the emergence of more and more complex niches. So then you get organisms which basically have to have a more complex cognition and more internal states, more states of the world they can experience. And we didn't really talk about that, so I won't get much into it, but that explains why sometimes it's good to, you don't need to be complicated, like to be successful in your environment. So there's this law of requisite variety. We'll skip the first one, but basically the law of requisite variety says that any system that has to live, control another system or live in a certain environment that they must control. So any organism that exists in any environment has to have as many accessible states as there are challenges in the environment. So we want to try to match our complexity to our environment. So Roger Penrose, for example, I read that he gets lost walking around the city and is just totally absent-minded. But he's super successful. But what I'm saying is that if you put Roger Penrose in some rural town like Selma, Alabama, he might be the town loon, right? He might just seem totally crazy and talking about like twister theory. No one's going to know what he's talking about. And so in that case, he might not be successful and all that genius would be wasted, but he's in a high complexity niche like academia, urban environment, and that works well for him. But someone else might do really well in a simple environment with a simpler worldview. They might have Christianity as their kind of guiding light and, you know, the 10 Commandments, for example. And that might work better as a strategy in that environment than a more complex worldview would in another environment. I don't know if it's optimal, but there's a reason that, for example, religion has stuck around. It's offers all kinds of adaptive practices and strategies, for example, that we just haven't understood because we haven't clarified the story of causality, of knowledge creation through this evolutionary process. Francis Heiligen, cyberneticist, says this principle has important implications for practical situations since the variety of perturbations a system can potentially be confronted with is unlimited. We should always try to maximize internal variety or diversity so as to be optimally prepared for every foreseeable or unforeseeable contingency. So as a whole civilization, we should try to maximize our number of cognitive states, maximize the amount of responses we have to any challenge. We should try to maximize our knowledge. So this has very real implications for society. Quickly here, so these things, same diagram as before, but all I'm showing here is that this creates all these designs and you have this competition process, which is this learning process of inference that I've described. But then these agents can actually come together and form a larger level system. And then that larger system can explore states through this same variation and selective process. You don't have to have multiple things. It can just be one collective system trying out different political ideologies like capitalism and socialism, for example. And when it finds one that works well, it gets retained in memory. And if it doesn't work well, it kind of just rejects it. So the evolutionary learning process is happening at every level in society. And we need to think about that because we need to think about, are we being optimal? And in this particular example, what I'm saying is that we're not being optimal because we're not testing out a bunch of different paradigms and we're not gathering evidence of how effective they were. So politicians have ideas all the time. They're not held accountable if the idea succeeds or not. We're not really collecting data on, okay, let's try this here. We're not even experimenting. So I would argue that capitalism was the best solution that we had at the time. And it doesn't need to be scrapped completely. It's actually a method of phylogenetic learning. What we just saw, there's competitive learning. There's learning that you get through competition, but there's also learning through cooperation and that you form this larger collective. And so I think socialism and capitalism kind of emphasize this competition and cooperation, and that possibly, some sort of hybrid system would be, maybe optimal. And the New Deal policies of FDR that were really successful were kind of like socialist policies. So I don't think any ideology in its extreme is good. It's going to be some solution coming from multiple things that we have to test. And there's going to be no one size fits all solution. And even if it works for right now for one place, it won't necessarily even work in the future. So there has to be constant testing, experimenting, gathering data, and then correcting for errors and using what works. And if we're not doing that, we have no idea if we've found the optimal social structure. I think, crypto economics could be like a third thing to like put into the mix with capitalism and socialism, and even ideas more experimental than that. So if we don't test, we have no idea what's the best. And so Bayesian reasoning, all I'm saying is basically we need to consider all possible theories when trying to explain something. And our models of the world will always be incomplete and inaccurate because they're coarse-grained models of the world, and we only have so much memory. So we should never think that our model is the answer to everything. We should always check our certainty. We should never be 100% certain that our theory is the right theory, or that free will is not real, or that life being significant goes against, science. Because your model, every model that has existed, Newtonian physics, general relativity, quantum mechanics, all of them have shown to be incomplete and replaced by, in some ways extended by the other ones. And those then have, revealed their own paradoxes and inconsistencies that point to something even larger. So I'm saying the evolution of paradigms is part of this evolutionary process, and that it's a continual learning process, and we have uncertainty always, and we're trying to reduce our ignorance and gain more knowledge. But to live optimally, we have to be aware of our ignorance. So when we're over certain, we're making mistakes all the time, whether it's just like, oh, I got sick, oh, masks don't work, or masks 100% work, and I'm protected if I wear a mask. Like, all of those things are theories that most of us, we have an idea and we completely live by that. And we don't really do anything to, test that or explore further all the different sides of the thing. Some of them are no brainers, so you don't need to think about. But for example, if you're a flat earther and we do an experiment and I take you up in a rocket and show you the earth and it happens to actually be round, and you come down and you don't update your model, you just continue with the flat earth theory, even though it's been shown to you. That's an extreme example, but you're not updating your model in a Bayes optimal manner. And what I'm saying is that we're doing this in real life all the time. And I could give a lot of examples, but they would sound kind of trivial. But I want to, in my next time I present this, to like really focus on specific things. But yeah, so there are all these different principles from this, using variation and selection as an optimization algorithm, setting goals. So when you set a goal, you like create an attractor, and basically that goal kind of alters your behavior and puts you on the path towards doing all the things causally necessary to achieve that goal. It's kind of why the law of attraction works. Like, you can get a non-bullshit version of the law of attraction with this. What I didn't get to talk about free will, but free will would be basically, we can exercise control over our automatic reflexive, impulsive behavior. And that we need to do that all the time. To basically, we have to gain an awareness that we're these sort of automatic creatures, and we have to engage reflective thought to override that behavior. And when everybody in society does that, that's part of bringing about this next phase transition. Like, there will be a new level of coherence when we all become meta aware. Not only that, but so this was like the free will stuff. You can see that, like, basically you have agency with regular biological organisms, and then free will with conscious control allowed by this prefrontal cortex. But so yeah, with this picture, we get a clear picture of how to optimize the individual and how to optimize society as a collective. And to bring about this transition towards this more globally coordinated state, this social phase transition, there needs to be a change at the level of the individual, of individual psychology, of your perspective. And I think that this unifying framework presents a sort of foundation for that perspective. And Hansi Freinach's political metamodernism that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk is kind of based on that idea, is that for what we should do politically, our goal to with that should be fostering growth at the individual level, like psychological growth. And so when we see that change at the cognitive level, we will see an emergence of like coherence at the social level, because this unifying worldview would basically align our interests and say, we're all in this together as a collective. And to solve this collective existential challenge, we have to work together. There's just no other way to do it. We can't solve our problems. We're all screwed unless we come together, and aligning interests will require some sort of unifying worldview. And I think this does that because it's a picture of a purposeful reality. There's lots that's compatible with religion and spirituality. And it says lots of practices in religion are adaptive, but it's also scientific. It's all mechanistic. And so, yeah, that's what the Road to Omega Project hopes to do, is to outline all of this, talk about all the practical implications, and then hopefully people like you in the community can help optimize these ideas, and then we can put it out to the world and see what it can do. So, yep, that's all.
Wow. Awesome. I always wish there was like an applause button I could push and just like everyone could hear the applause.
You
But
need
anyway,
jazz hands.
yeah. Little finger snaps. Bobby, that was great. Thank you so much. Um, yeah, well, so officially, we've got about 10 minutes. We can push that a little bit, 15, maybe 20 max for questions. So if anyone has anything that they want to throw out, I'm going to ask Bobby a question, and now would be the time. I just wanted to mention something that came up for me while you were speaking real quick, but I won't say much because you and I have had the opportunity to have podcast conversations and whatnot. But it was just interesting how it occurred to me how the theory of continental drift or tectonic plates used to be one of these ideas that was like, people would laugh at it. It'd be like, it was recognized that, hey, South America looks a lot like it could fit together with Africa really well. And everyone was like, oh, that's a crazy idea.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
But then it was literally not until like the late 60s, 70s until that idea became standard and accepted. And now everyone just takes it for granted. But that was a hard sell for many decades. And when I hear you talking about a lot of these things, I think it seems in some ways very obvious, but with all the pushback that comes in, people are like, oh, well, we can't necessarily, maybe whatever. But
as extreme of an example, I just like to throw this one out there because it makes us think. The flat earther thing, like 1,000 years ago, 500 years ago, we would have the idea that the earth was round would seem completely insane. We would pretty much attach zero likelihood because people would be like, what do you mean it's round? What about when we're upside down? We would just fall. And like, no, there's this thing called gravity and there's a force. Like, well, why don't we fall off the cliff when we go upside down? Oh, well, it has to be bigger to have this. Like, it just sounds crazy. So when you have a flat earther, for example, we shouldn't discourage that person considering that theory, but we should try to have a method where we say, okay, what would that theory predict if it were true compared to alternative theories? Now let's try to get to the bottom of it.
Yeah.
But cutting that out, just going, that's crazy. We're doing that all the time as a society. That is terrible.
Yeah.
We've seen it with, like, for example, COVID. The lab leak theory was off limits because of, PC concerns, basically, which were understandable. But it was like, if you said that theory and even considered it, it was like you were this, right-wing person or conspiracy theory nut or whatever. And then, CNN, these channels saying like, it's a crazy theory. And then 6 months later, they had to walk it back when people are saying, actually, this considers, and, people, if you look at all the evidence, we should have this on the table as a possible theory. And people like Nate Silver, statistician, was like, we should be good Bayesians. He literally said that about that topic, and just people were like destroying him. Like, basically, he was like right-wing nut for just saying that, and that's very dangerous. So
so let's open this up to questions. Also, feel free, you can put the question in the chat, and I can read it for you if you don't want to be on camera. Otherwise, I see Sally, you've got your hand raised. Take it away.
Yeah, thanks. Great, Bobby. That was absolutely delicious. I absolutely
thanks, Sally. I appreciate it.
I'm so excited by your work, and it's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you.
I have a quick question, because much of my work echoes yours in the evolutionary pairings and how that produces creativity. So that's my focus.
Very
and
cool.
I want to ask you a specific thing, because I think I might be using the wrong word. And so it's really important for me to clarify with you. You've used the word rhyme, recursive emergence.
Mm-hmm.
And I talk about patterns at scale and fractals. How are those different, please?
No, they're not different. It would be part of that explanation. So I'm glad you brought that up too, because I forgot to include this in the talk. But when you look at this story of recursive emergence, so you basically have simple organisms emerging like a single cell, and then those come together to make multicellular organisms and then societies. But what you have is the same pattern, the same functional pattern that we call a complex adaptive system being mirrored at each of these levels. And so it's recursively realizing this at these higher and higher levels. And if you look at that whole process, and actually when you go to the inanimate world, it's not exactly the same. I think complex adaptive systems, like systems don't become adaptive until you have life, you have these information processing systems. But there are ways that even at that inanimate scale, there's something analogous to this process of recursive emergence that we kind of showed in that thing. And then, when subatomic particles come together to make atoms, for example, there's kind of like a social thing going on. And Howard Bloom has written a lot about that in his books. So when you look at the whole picture of this, I'm saying that's absolutely what cosmic evolution is. It's kind of this fractal structure, and it's continually generating novel patterns. The patterns are rhymes on the patterns that came before it because they sort of mirror that lower level pattern. But with each new emergence, there's an elaboration on that pattern. And so that's why it's called poetic metaнаturalism. It's kind of like reality doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. So for example, a society will have dynamics at the social level that comes from emotions, that comes from love, that comes from hate, all of these kinds of things that are dynamics that might have primitive analogs at a lower level, but aren't exactly the same. And so it's not enough to go, it's the same pattern at every scale, because it's not. There's actual emergences. We didn't talk about the distinction between strong and weak emergence. Some people, object to strong emergence as a concept. I'm saying that's been defined wrong, and we should actually call these things strong emergences. But there are new emergences where things like consciousness comes into the world and self-awareness, and they allow for new causal capabilities. So for example, what consciousness does, which we didn't talk about, and that's really, I think I skipped that talking about my background, but so my PhD is in neuroscience. I did a lot of psychology work with looking at visual attention and how anxiety influences our attention. Basically, so consciousness is an important part of this. What consciousness allows is it's not just this useless thing that's just this illusion and that everything is determined without consciousness. What consciousness permits us to do that organisms without this rich of consciousness intelligence can't do. So this is associated with like really the prefrontal cortex. We can use our imagination, and our imagination is actually this virtual simulation of the world. It's this model of the world we've mapped out through learning and through our evolutionary history. And we can use consciousness to simulate futures that aren't easy to understand without this conscious simulation. So if you have a job offer and it's in a different country, and there's all these different variables relating to whether you should take that or not, you might close your eyes at night. Maybe you went to a job interview there and you imagine, well, what would it be like working there? What would it be like to listen to this boss every day? And what I'm saying is that ability to imagine and simulate in your mind that specific future, that's not possible without consciousness, because you can't do this kind of counterfactual assessment. So counterfactuals would be, all these different possible scenarios, things you haven't experienced in the past either, like we have no precedent for. So we have to use our imagination. So what consciousness does is it allows us this whole new level of creativity where we can take patterns we've stored, where we can do all kinds of transformations. And then what we imagine, we can actually bring into the world. So we might have this obscure idea for something like Facebook that no one understands. And then we see it though, and we've understood it, and we know it can influence the world, and it does that and surprises everybody. What I'm saying is that without consciousness, we're limited. So that's an example of an emergence that actually gives us causal influence that inanimate systems don't have, and that non-conscious systems don't have. And so there is true emergence. And because of that, our creative capacity with each new emergence also gets stronger. So it is a fractal pattern. We need to understand it that way. And the fractal is continuously generating elaborations on this pattern. And that's a very different story than an inanimate world that just kind of slowly falls apart. And I'm saying that maybe there might not be a limit to this creativity either. So I wrote an article for, it's really optimistic. I mean, it's like something we all want to hear. As I'm laughing, it's like, we all want to hear it, but most people, like, this is not something that just makes us feel good. Like, that's not why I believe it. I would just believe religion if I wanted something to make me feel good. The problem is I need something that makes sense too, or else I know that it's BS, or I wonder if it's BS, and it affects the ability for that worldview to actually be comforting to me. So this is, I think, when you start looking at the full picture, we just see this outline of this purposeful universe, and that's the way it is. And David Deutsch has basically said that knowledge, the causal power of knowledge, is unlimited. And John Horgan, a Scientific American journalist, was like, I don't understand your optimism. He's like, no, this is just the way, this is the best explanation for reality, and it happens to be optimistic. But yeah, and I wrote an article for Noema, people could check out, called Life Need Not Ever End. David Deutsch tweeted that, but it argues that our understanding of the second law of thermodynamics is mistaken, and that maybe there's no limit to how long life can go on, and how much knowledge can spread. But that's a whole other topic. So yeah.
Anything else, Sally, or did that answer your question?
I could spend hours, but I want to know the difference between imagination and consciousness, but you can't answer that now.
Next time
consciousness permits it, but yeah, maybe I'll come on your podcast, any other podcast. I haven't checked it out yet.
Ooh,
but
that'd be cool.
I like the theme of it a lot. Yeah.
All right. Thanks, Sally.
Bob.
We got 2 more questions, and then that'll probably take us to time. But next up is Brett.
Hey, Brett.
Thanks. Hey, Bobby. Thanks, Brendan. I'm just going to follow up on the delicious, Sally. I love that. That's how I feel about this whole conversation. The deliciousness is, Brendan, can we try to organize a podcast with Bobby and Donald Hoffman? It really struck me today. I'm a big fan of Donald Hoffman's work, both is what he does scientifically, mathematically, and also just seemingly character and where he's coming from. He really inspires me, just his attitude and how he goes about things. And it just struck me today. I mean, I knew this, but he was also coming from a cognitive neuroscience background.
Yeah.
So for that reason alone, I would find the conversation interesting between the two of you. So I just wanted to ask you, how familiar are you with his work? And would you love to be on a podcast that we maybe all organize for that? Because I think it's brilliant. And he talks about entropy a certain way, because he's trying to go beyond space-time. And he, his equations and his way of going about it is seemingly showing that before space-time, entropy doesn't exist in the same way that we're used to. And I'm not doing a good service to Donald Hoffman's work here, by the way. So I'm just kind of asking, like, do you like his work? How do you relate to it? And would you
I would
down
love
for
to
a
see,
conversation?
Yeah, I would love to see what he says about entropy, specifically regarding that point about space-time not existing. So yeah, I'd love
Well, it
to.
exists, by the way, just for the sake of Donald Hoffman. He's saying space-time exists. It's just not fundamental. Like you were saying, Newtonianism got transcended included by quantum, which got transcended included by that. And what he's working on would transcend and include quantum and unified field theories.
Yeah, I said that sloppily. Not existing at some point in the past, but that the entropy matters only after space-time emerges, because space-time is emergent in that model. There are things that we agree about. Like, I love the sense of mystery that his kind of paradigm, is bringing to people. And I think there's a lot that's right about it. I think we might disagree about a couple things, but he's been someone that I would love to talk to, because I think, that we're kind of seeing something similar. So his big ideas, one is just that we're not seeing reality as it is. It's kind of like icons on a desktop, and that evolution doesn't actually allow us to see reality in some more objective, or to get to objective truth, that we're actually getting farther away from the real nature of reality, because it's not adaptive to perceive all the things about reality. I think there's some truth to that, but I also think that we are modeling the world in more detail, and we know that because we're gaining more causal power over it. Modeling it allows us to leave the planet, for example, and influence the cosmos. So I kind of have some issues with that. And then the other thing is that consciousness is fundamental, and maybe everything emerges from it. And I have to understand more what he means by that, but I like that. And I'm not arguing against that. I'm actually saying that there is this sort of design that creates this trajectory that could imply that the universe is some sort of in creation of an intentional agent. But there are some language issues I have with saying, like, is the whole universe conscious? Like, I'm not sure that's good wording, but I'd love to. Yeah, I'm glad that you threw that idea out there, Brett. So yeah, if Brendan wants to try, that'd be great.
Thanks for your time. Maybe Brendan, if you know anyone, or I'll help. I don't know. I'm not a guy who knows everybody, but let's see if we can make that happen.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I think that would be actually really fitting for, if not, well, how would I say? So, I mean, ARC is really a lot about trying to bring these kinds of different conversations into conversation with each other. So that would be a very fitting kind of co-discussion or panel or something. I was actually just, well, yeah, anyway, yeah, there's a lot to follow up on there. It's a great idea, and stay tuned on that. So thanks. Yeah. Okay. One more question.
I just want to say, love what Brett's doing too, because he's really trying to bring some sort of worldview like this to the mainstream consciousness through a bunch of different projects, and he's going to be helping out with the Road to a Mega project too. So I want to thank Brett for that.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So I see Libor or Libor. How do you say your name?
Libor. Slavic.
Libor. All right, take it away.
Libor. I like the R roll at the end of that. I'm going to practice that and get that R down.
Yes. Hey, Bobby. Amazing stuff. I'm following your work for a long time. We've exchanged some messages already.
Thanks for coming.
I think we did a lot of convergent evolution when it comes to thinking. So that's pretty great. I love how you mentioned annealing. That's like my mind is just annealing and thinking about how to use that practically for collective and individual mental health. So, and I like how you used one quote from Schmartzhumber. And I don't know how much familiar are you with his other work on how to essentially find conditions to make society more adaptable and more and align values, like such that exponential tech doesn't destroy us, but we control the exponential tech instead, and how to coordinate the game theoretically different people. I like to see all of that in the Bayesian lens also. So have you looked into that also?
Yeah. So I found out about Daniel a few years ago when I was thinking about the book, or maybe writing the book, and I was like, this guy's really onto something. He's talking about all the right things, and he's talking about it in a way that people can understand. So that's another thing, is like he's not talking like academics. He's trying to connect with real people. However, I think this story is essential to what he's trying to do. And if he doesn't see this story, the impact of what he's saying is limited. What this does is take everything that he's talking about, like aligning values, and it puts it on this theoretical foundation where it's like, it's not just this guy's opinion anymore. There's some sort of objective process, and you have these optimization principles, and we can use those. So I think without this overarching theory, he's limited, and that, if someone can show this to Daniel and get Daniel to watch it, that would be a big win, because I tried to send him the book and didn't hear from him. It's funny who you can get through to. It's like easier to get Joe Rogan interested in this than it is Daniel, apparently. But I would love to have a discussion with him about this.
I'm attempting to do the same thing. I was thinking that in a very similar thing. I was thinking that how he's talking about strengthening top-down values, essentially, of the whole society. So coordinating values of people more. So I, like, for example, through common thread or through common ideology and so on, as a way to coordinate people. That's pretty great stuff. Yeah.
And it's top-down causation too. So it's similar to this free will concept I didn't get into. And there's lots of people who object to things I've said because I haven't been able to explain that, because there's never enough time. But basically, there are kind of principles that would apply at the social level and the cognitive level. And I'm glad people are talking about that stuff, but if you don't make that connection, it's hard to see how they all fit together. And hopefully what I've tried to show is that the evolutionary process is this Bayesian process, this Bayesian event inference, and then it gives us a sort of map for how we should reason. And so what this does is it'll unify different communities talking about solutions. Like Sean Carroll and Julia Galef is a philosopher who have been talking about the merits of Bayesian reasoning, Steven Pinker. If we can unite that kind of rational crew of people with the sort of emergence sort of game B type people with Daniel and, you know, Jim Rutt and people like that, that's when I think we can find this paradigm that actually like, so we have to bring the groups together and show them how they're part of this. And then it will become something that can actually have an influence, because basically we need to create a signal. And if it's just academics talking about it, it can't create, you know, that signal. If it's just people who are kind of in these spiritual communities and connected to like Integral or whatever, there's limits to who you can reach to. So there needs to be some sort of unified approach. And my hope is that it could influence like the next presidential election. I think we have two terrible options. I think one option is better than the other option by a lot, but they're very bad options. So let's maybe try to think of a platform that encourages systems thinking, that encourages Bayesian reasoning, that encourages a philosophy of the need for cooperation. And if we do that, and there's the right messaging, then maybe this could become something that actually has an influence on the real world, but much easier said than done.
I love it. There's I think three more people or three more groups that could be added into this, like Qualer Research Institute, which I'm part of.
Yeah, I saw you posted. I love the stuff you post too. But yeah,
they formalize annealing essentially, and then a group of Adam Safron
awesome.
and Carl Harris also, I think, they formalized that annealing more on the neurobiology side. So
so Adam, I interviewed this AI guy, and Adam was present, and Adam's helping out with this Road to Omega project and kind of helping me
nice.
Along with Brendan and some others. Marco Lynn is another one. I don't know if you're familiar with Marco, but he's kind of from like the Fristonian community. So I would love to bring all those people together. And Adam is already has some projects where he's trying to do similar stuff. Gomez, Andres, I forget his name, but
yes.
Yeah, I wrote him a little bit. I don't think he knows who I am, but I would like to talk to him and try to find some synergy between the Road to Omega project and Qualia Research Institute, because I think he's doing some really cool stuff.
Yes.
And Robin Carhart Harris is cool. I worked with him on Minefield. I booked him we sent Vsauce to Peru to do ayahuasca, and I basically hooked him up with Robin. So yeah, I haven't talked to Robin for a couple of years, but I think, he's there. Him and Adam are working on this theory of understanding consciousness, but understanding like in a framework that also includes psychedelics and the effects of psychedelics on consciousness. And I'm a big proponent of psychedelics, and think that needs to be part of the conversation as well.
I would also love to help.
All right, Libor. Well, I'll definitely follow up with you about that. Thanks for coming. I appreciate the question.
Awesome. Also, thanks for that. And I was going to say, Andres would be a great person to get involved with this broader conversation around these arch-disciplinary arches as well. So that could be something we also look into. And then William, I think William had a question as well.
Hey, William, nice to see you in person.
Hi there. I actually, I had my hand up before and then it disappeared. So I had to, I'm going to keep it brief because we've already gone on for quite a bit, but it's a pleasure.
My fault. I know it always ends up going wrong. Yeah.
No, it's a pleasure to see you and talk to you and hear more about your ideas. I also, one of the things I did want to say, you can all hear me clearly, by the way?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So one of the things I wanted to say is something that other people have been saying also. I really appreciate the opportunity to exchange ideas, and I'm wondering if there can be some more of a forum where, forum, open-ended seminar, conference, whatever, where we get to bring in viewpoints from different people and extend it in different directions.
That's awesome.
Not just one-on-one or even two-on-one or whatever, but a broader discussion group, whether that's like a book discussion group or something of the sort. I don't know, but I very much like that idea.
Yeah, that's great. That's, I think, a good way to wrap up too. I think that's super important because I think this is the age of generalists as opposed to specialists. And my professor, Harold Morowitz, who was external faculty at one of the founding members of SFI, and I was at George Mason. That's where I got my PhD. He was a generalist, and at this level that I strive to, but I can never reach it. But because he understood physics and mathematics and chemistry at this like expert level, including everything else. And then he taught these courses like on the arts and philosophy and knew Persian poetry and stuff, for example. But he kind of showed me that you can strive to be what Howard Bloom calls an omnologist. An omnologist is kind of like a person who he says like the something like the infinitely curious or something. But basically, I think everyone needs to try to get a good understanding of all of the sciences, and the people working in academia are specialists. And so I'm not saying that you have to master everything or know some sort of high level mathematics. I know enough mathematics to do the kind of statistical tests that I need to do for my experiments. So what I'm saying is that the people in these communities, the people I see online, they seem to be soaking up more knowledge from different areas than the academics do, where the academics are very focused on certain things, and then other ideas outside that sound crazy to them, or they're not interested in it. So I think progress is going to come from the generalists, and anybody can do that. So if we're only relying on them and we're having these closed conversations, we don't have a good diversity of opinions. And so that point about complexity being a function of diversity and interconnection, we need a diversity of ideas to ensure that we're finding the right or optimal ideas. And you can't have that unless you have like a lot of people talking. So I would love to do that. I have a Facebook page called the Neuromantics. The Neuromantics are pretty much the community behind the Road to Omega project. And it's kind of like a fun, catchy name, spelled N-E-U, like neuro, because I think branding is important. And so we're focusing on that as well. But I haven't really launched that page. There has been a little bit of discussion, but I'm going to link that in Meta Modern Spirituality because I do want to have the community involved. If you want to sign up for my Road to Omega Substack, that's how I'm going to communicate with people. But Road to Omega is absolutely about creating community and listening to people's ideas and seeing if the community can actually influence the trajectory of the project. So we'll find a way to do that. And maybe I'll make a post just thinking, how can we bring the community in and make this discussion more diverse? If ARC wants to do something similar, that'd be great too. But I don't know, Brendan, someone else might know if ARC has something.
No, I mean, that's very much the vision and the goal and the telos of all this is to do precisely that, trying to bring people together, have broader conversations, and that'll take different forms. We're already kind of planning various more specific kinds of conversations across different metatheoretical spheres, but then also very, broadly speaking, trying to bring kind of this sphere together. And I think, Bobby, you named it exactly right, that we've entered a period where generalization and synthesis is again crucial and important. It's always been that, but there's been this dialectic back and forth, especially in the academy. And I think that the postmodern academy has been very dominated by particularization, and it's always just eschewed generalization as like the devil. So there's a back and forth that always kind of is part of the very dialectic that you're describing or have been describing, right? And we're re-entering that phase now where people are thinking in big ways again and trying to integrate as well that particularization that happens, because it's always differentiation and then integration, differentiation to integration, right? That's a complexity.
Yeah, and at this stage of like interconnection, all of the fields are bleeding into each other. So you can't really think about AI without thinking about consciousness, without thinking about life, without thinking about economics.
Yeah, so and that's kind of the mission statement of something like we are beyond the need even for something transdisciplinary. So arch disciplinarity is really trying to explore this terrain that's opening up. And it's not going to be the only one. It's other folks are doing this too, but we're really trying to do just that. So yeah, we welcome all these different incredible Substacks, and we're just kind of here to try to bring these different voices together and facilitate that as much as possible. So yeah. This was amazing. I really love this. I'm not seeing any other questions, and we're up against the 2-hour mark. So there will be other opportunities in the future. And Bobby, I don't know. I'd love to talk to you about free will at some time when you got some dedicated time to talk about that, or some of the other things that we didn't.
Yeah, and that's going to be that's a big topic that I do want to dive into. And I'm working on an article. I'm going to pitch it to Big Think in Michael Garfield in the fossil fuel. Future Fossils community talked about having this kind of dialectical exercise where I write something in support of free will, and someone and I think that dialectical dynamic is really what we need to advance these discussions, because it's kind of like a dead end. But I will say that the self is an informational structure. There was a big confusion about, because it was defined as something non-physical, that the mind was non-physical, and then if you go there, then it seems outside of science. But if you understand that the self is this high level neural attractor that corresponds to this thing called a global workspace, and that basically when you're having this phenomenological experience, when you're using reflective thought and making decisions, you're actually the locus of control, and that you can exercise top-down control over these lower level sort of algorithmic intelligence centers in the brain. And that's exercising free will. But that gets into there's a lot of language issues that have prevented us from coming to some sort of, making progress on that. And I talked to you, Brandon, about some of that, but really the language is this big issue. And when you see this story of these patterns at these, being repeated at these different levels, then it's you realize people are arguing over, is evolution really learning? What I'm saying is you can show that they're a functionally equivalent algorithm and that they create knowledge in the same way. So we don't need to fight over that. Is the biosphere an organism? It doesn't matter if you want to call it, we can fight about if it's an organism all day, how you defined it. But what I'm saying is that it's this pattern that's a complex adaptive system. And so if we want to find out if Gaia, the biosphere is an organism, we have to first define what we mean by organism. And it's going to have some properties of a biological organism, but it's going to differ in some other ways. And so what this worldview does is it shows you, if we did it in detail, this is just a rough outline, it would ideally show you the relations between all things. And then that really just changes how we're using language. So we kind of remap language onto these new ideas. And I think that would clarify a lot of issues that we've just hit a dead end with, and it's really semantics games
and part of these archdisciplinary theories that we're trying to explore or even co-create together are in some ways a semantic thing of trying to find the new terms, the new language that can do that kind of a work. But anyway, there's so much more obviously that could be said, and there will be more opportunities to get into all that. But thank you so much, Bobby. This was great. Really appreciated it.
Thanks everybody for coming. Thanks ARC for setting this up.
Yeah, you bet. So next Salon will be happening soon. We'll be putting out more information on that as it happens. But for now, take care, everyone, and till next time.
All right.
Thank you.